we've been spearheading this whole idea about digital employee experience and thus this conference. And normally, I'm the guy who's up the front, who's looking like an idiot, wearing a Dex superhero shirt, waving my hands, talking about big pictures, inspirational stuff, things of the future. And that's not this session. This session is super practical. This is about how to make stuff happen, acknowledging this reality that we live in the same world that you do, that not everyone, but the vast majority of people are in SharePoint Online. So the vast majority of our clients in the work that we're doing are in SharePoint Online. And so, we are tipped into this whole question about how do we deliver effective intranets just like everyone else. And that's kind of exciting. But the fundamental principles that have been pulled together over the last 25 years by us and others are still absolutely true. So those haven't changed, and we're going to kind of really look at those. But it is safe to say that SharePoint Online is a thing of its own, a beast that has its own way of doing things that we need to really make use of where they're powerful and effective. And sometimes, of course, we need to work around in terms of the limitations that may or may not go away in the future. And if we look at the sort of what are these fundamentals, then really, to my mind, they boil down to four things. So the four fundamentals. So intranets have to be usable. Humans, normal humans, not special people like us, normal humans need to be able to use intranets in effective and efficient ways for themselves. The intranets need to be findable. And so we've looked a lot at this in the conference up to this point. So how do we make sure that search is effective? How do we make sure that the navigation in the intranet is allowing people to find what they need in time-effective ways? Intranets need to be fundamentally valuable. Intranets are not owed a living. They actually have to work for the organization. They have to deliver value for individuals and deliver value for the organization as a whole. And lastly, they need to be governed. I mean, as outlined beautifully in Beth's presentation, there's a lot of work that needs to be put in place to ensure that intranets are going to be effective over time. So if these are the four fundamental sort of factors that drive successful intranets, the good news is that SharePoint Online Modern, unlike Classic, allows you to deliver effective intranets in a largely non-technical way. So the SharePoint of old was both ugly and horrible, but also incredibly costly because you had to do a huge amount of technical work to deliver an intranet that was fundamentally useful. That has changed. That's one of the big benefits that Microsoft has delivered. Allows us all to get in there and deliver a site, which allows us, therefore, to focus our attention on the fundamentals and getting those in place. So I'm going to work through each of these, and we're going to look at, so what are the best practices that have been developed over the last 25 years? And then what does that mean in practical terms in SharePoint Online? Now, I'm not an MVP in this space. And so, you're going to ask a lot of questions and I'm not going to be able to answer them all, but actually I'm fine with it. Because again, SharePoint Online is delivered in the real world by everyone on this call, including us. So I am fine that I know some things that I can share useful answers for, and there'll be other people on the call that will be able to contribute to this as well. So I'm going to tackle usable and findable together because these two things are often considered as a whole, and rightly so. So in terms of best practices, so clearly we need to deliver intranets in a way that makes sense to humans, in this case, employees and other employee-like people. There is a field that's been around for a very long time, well before intranets were created, around whatever you want to call it, user experience, UX, or human-centered design. And these fields offer practical techniques that you can use to ensure that what is delivered is both usable and findable. And at the heart of these techniques is the idea about task-based user testing. That is, we find actual users, employees, and we give them actual tasks and we find out whether they can actually do them. And so this makes them incredibly powerful in the real world. Now there's, I guess, a well-trodden path for how to create effective sites. So going back to Dot's designing intranet, this is, the standard process that was outlined then. We create prettier diagrams now, but they actually have the same structure, understand how users think, develop draft structures, test them, develop page designs, test those and deliver. So that's techniques such as card sorting, both in terms of in the physical world, which we still occasionally do, with filing cards and the like, or online, and also techniques like tree testing and the tool TreeJack by Optimal Workshop, so lovely folks in New Zealand, that provides online tree testing. So these are kind of the fundamental techniques along with others. What does that then mean in SharePoint Online? Because actually there's quite a lot of differences in the practical approach. So the first thing we need to recognize is that SharePoint intranets are not websites. They do not follow sort of the classical hierarchical structure. They have their own way of working. And so we need to follow the grain of the platform. We've decided individually and largely collectively that we are going to go into SharePoint Online as our platform of choice for our intranet. And so because we've made that choice, we now need to live within the world of SharePoint and how it wants to think and how it wants to work in practice. So one of the big differences, for example, is that we no longer talk about information architecture in our practical work, because actually there is no place in which the 4 or 5 level deep classical information architecture is actually expressed within the platform. Instead, we talk about two different things. We talk about the navigation experience and we talk about the site architecture. And I'm going to work through each of those in a second. We also don't do things like wireframes anymore on the whole. Instead, we prototype in the platform, but we still absolutely use task-based testing in the development of SharePoint intranets. So what does that mean in practice? So as most people on the call would know, SharePoint Online, unlike SharePoint Classic, has a fundamentally flat structure. So there are a lot of sites. They all sort of float in a pool sitting at the same level. And this actually has a lot of advantages. So in our complex, ever-changing organizations, where organization structure changes all the time, we reorg and group things together in different ways, this gives us the flexibility to deliver the same fundamental content and services to employees and not have to change them every 5 minutes as the organization changes. And in more complex organizations, global organizations like Beth's, for example, this gives us a lot of flexibility about delivering information in different ways for particular audiences geographically and in other ways. There are some oddities. So it is worth recognizing that actually a site, as Microsoft themselves call it in all of their documentation, is actually a site collection, which used to be in SharePoint Classic, the big grouping in which whole intranets would sit. That's now a single site. So that's, it doesn't necessarily make a big impact on how we work, but it is worth knowing. In particular, because if you're working with some of the SharePoint techies, you'll find them talking about site collections And you'll just need to pause and go, right, so by that you mean a site in layman's terms. The other thing is that there are still subsites because there are site collections, but they're evil. Don't use them. You should probably turn them off because, again, we're going to go with this religion of flat is good, and then we're going to make that work. There is some ways of putting structure around things. So there are hubs within SharePoint Online. So these do allow you to group sites. There are now hubs within hubs, if that brings joy to your heart or not. Hubs are useful. So they do allow you to group sites together from a governance or a conceptual perspective. Probably the most useful feature is that they allow you to provide local navigation and local search. So the whole scoped search thing and the way Microsoft works, Hubs gives you a useful way of searching just an area. That being said, Hubs don't do a lot. So the functionality for them is limited. They talk about a shared branding, but you only get to pick one color. So in a logo, so shared branding is not exactly a lot. Maybe more functionality will be added over time. The key thing, though, to recognize is that they don't express it information architecture. So we have seen organizations attempt to use this to create the traditional structure of intranets, but again, it's not expressed to users in a useful way. In terms then of the navigation, so there are three forms of navigation. So there is what they call top menus, the traditional menu that can be a straightforward set of drop downs. It can be a mega menu. So there's good functionality around this. That being said, as you'd no doubt be aware, these menus are not global. There are also some odd features. So if you have hub navigation and local site navigation, you get two menus above each other, which is a unique SharePoint thing. But the biggest constraint that people generally come across is that while you can create this on your home site, and we'll talk more about that later, this is not reflected out across the whole intranet unless you use a third-party product or you do some manual work or you do some fancy automation behind the scenes. Local navigation is still critical. Helping users make the first click was always the easy bit in intranets. We've always said design the intranet all the way to the bottom because actually the local navigation can be the most important thing. I've landed in HR, now where? And there's a variety of ways in which you can do this in quite elegant fashion in SharePoint Online. And then, of course, there's the app bar, relatively new to the game here, makes it consistent with Microsoft Teams. The great news is that this does give you global navigation that is truly global for the whole tenant, which to Beth's point, she highlighted there may be other SharePoint sites floating around that are not the intranet, but hey, they get your global menu anyway, which actually I'm fine with. There is, I think, some challenges around adoption. So in terms of the change piece and the digital literacy piece, I do think we need to communicate to people that this thing exists and this is how to use it. So then how does this come together? So if we then look at sites and hubs, then this is probably best looked at in the context of the management and governance of the intranet. So if we create a site where there may be a single set of content that's managed by one group versus other areas. And so it's very much around how do we structure this in a way that makes sense. And that may be organizationally behind the scenes in terms of your content creators. And I'm fine with that. Because the great thing I think about SharePoint Online is that then we can take this top-down view in terms of findability, where we design a navigation that really works for users, whether that's on the home site or whether that's on the global menu in the app bar. And then we can drop that navigation down into anywhere we like. And now these two things are separate and can be managed in a coordinated way, but in parallel. And so this is really great. And I think this is the aspect we want to make most use of going forward. So then what does that look like in practice? So we're currently working for a Big Four bank, which I won't name. This is a simplified version of what we help them come up with in terms of the site architecture. So that is how the hubs and sites come together. So in the home site, we lumped the vast majority of the corporate services content, including a lot of the mission, vision, organizational strategy stuff. So quite a lot of stuff sat within the home site. We then created a news hub because then that enabled us to structure stuff behind the scenes that then was usefully presented on the front end. So by having a site for top level organizational news, which is owned by corporate comms, they get a channel. And then we created, in this instance, another area where the news published by other folks could be brought together. And then when that's presented on the intranet, you get that nice little tag that shows where the news is brought from, noting that actually there's a lot of different ways of doing this. And then because this is a Big Four bank, the divisions themselves are the size of everyone else's organizations. And so each of them gets a hub with quite a lot of sites sitting in underneath this. And there's the majority of the content sits in here. And so this was a way of coming up with a structure that made sense to the bank behind the scenes. So then in terms of what that looks like in terms of the navigation experience, well, then we're, as flagged before, we're able to use things like TreeJack to go and do some really great testing. So this was the view information about flexible working tasks. So this is the task given to users with the draft navigation experience. And then we were able to see how effective the navigation was and where there were issues. And this was pretty good. This is a 91% success rate and 89% of people went directly to the correct location. So sweet, in 6.84 seconds on average. Okay. And then the other nice thing about TreeJack is that you get really funky sciencey diagrams, which you can then use when working with stakeholders to say, I know that you believe your special thing is really special and should be on the top menu, but actually we've tested it and we want to make sure people can find your special content, and that's according to the testing in this other location. And so again, this is all classic UX techniques, and they work beautifully well within the Microsoft environment. And then that enabled the navigation experience to be created. And this is an early draft. It's actually being updated as we speak. It's a living thing within this project. There's two things I want to note here. So first off, the structure that is expressed within the navigation, you'll note, has almost nothing to do with the site architecture behind the scenes. So even though we lumped an awful lot of stuff into the home hub, we're then able to split it out into working at the organization, products and services, about us, such that we create, well, the illusion of, I guess, a typical intranet navigation that people are used to from sites of old. And so we've now delivered this in this environment, dropping stuff down, links down into the various sites. The other thing I want to highlight here is that the light blue links, they're actually to resources outside of the intranet, either in other SharePoint sites governed separately and launched previously to the new intranet, or actually out into entirely other environments. So for example, a lot of the working at stuff, the HR information, is sitting within ServiceNow. And so this global navigation, which again is expressed in the global app bar, is then able to generate this really effective navigation that cuts across the complexity of the organization. And again, that's the power of separating this stuff out. Now, it involves a bit of a cognitive shift as well as engagement with a lot of stakeholders across the organization to get buy-in, but I think this is a really powerful outcome. And then, of course, it's important to highlight that this is not just about hierarchical structures. As per Patrick's talk, taxonomies are an incredibly useful approach. And there is good, not outstanding, but there is good support within SharePoint for this. So in terms of the managed metadata and the centralized term store, you're able to come up with these faceted classifications that you're able to use in different environments. And so this is from a different project that we're working with a national non-profit. And this was for their policy center, policy hub, whatever you want to call it. And so this is where there isn't a folder structure that makes sense. Instead, we're going to classify documents according to type, audience, and topic. And if we look at topic, then look again, here is a UX-driven structure that enables the information to be not just classified, but then easily found. And then this is expressed using things like PnP modern search to give a local, richer way of finding things. And this support for content types and facets, I think, is one of the nicest features within SharePoint and so often underutilized. And so I'd love us all to be doing more of this. And then the last component of UX is then page designs. Okay, and for a long time, we've done wireframes in a whole pile of different tools, online and not. And these are a very, very effective approach for looking at how are we going to lay things out in a page that gets us away from graphic design and page design. We don't do this much at all anymore because actually we find it both easier, quicker, and more effective to directly prototype this stuff. Because again, SharePoint Modern is a point-and-click environment for everyone, including us. And so we're able to create pages like this really, really easily. And then this is still a mock-up because there are elements of this that we've kind of dropped in as text or as images. So for example, the top right-hand corner, we've got My Tasks, and we've done this as a sample of having a unified task list. The bottom right, funds under management, 1.82 billion. In this prototype, this is dropped in as a graphic, but with a little annotation at the bottom to say, this is where we would like to have a little bit of automation to draw this directly out of back-end systems. And so we're very easily able to pull stuff together that we can then work through with users and work through as stakeholders. And then we are able to close that gap where in the past you kind of throw the design over the fence to the developers and hope that the right things came out. Well, now because what we've produced as intranet teams is so much closer to the final solution, then that gap is really closed, both in terms of time, cost, and coherence from the design process to delivery. And of course, we can still go through and annotate this in the same way that we would have in the past with wireframes, adding notes about how these things would work and who would own them, where there might need to be custom development. And so this still allows us as, intranet teams to provide the information that the technical folks need, either in-house or sort of third-party, SharePoint developers need in order to deliver stuff. So if that is then the design process and making things usable and findable, then what about ensuring intranets are valuable? So in terms of best practices, most of our intranets are useful. That is to say, no one would ever consider turning them off. That being said, most intranets, sadly, are not much loved. So there's this thing that we have and we accept, but doesn't bring joy into our hearts. So that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But what we really want to be targeting is intranets that are essential. That is to say, a key part of day-to-day work, particularly of frontline and operational staff, and directly supporting the goals of the organisation in terms of whatever that is, delivering services or products or research, innovation, whatever. And then in order to achieve that, we really need to understand employee needs deeply as a starting point for then making all of our decisions in terms of both, strategy, planning, scoping, and design. Now, we've championed user research, field research techniques for an enormous length of time now. And there's all sorts of techniques, so there's surveys and focus groups, which are used to engage large numbers of organizations. There's your traditional sort of IT, requirements gathering process as done by a business analyst. So, these are okay. There are deeper ways of researching. So there's one-on-one staff interviews. So this is sitting down with people from across the organization, not to ask them what they want. Because whatever you do, don't ask users what they want. We're going to understand what they need by learning about what they do. And as I said, interviews are a great way of digging into depth on that. But it's also about things like workplace observations, sitting within the environment that people are working in, and then seeing what are the physical things that they use that they've pinned to the walls or have got in their home working environments now, which does make it a little more challenging. And this is also about engaging with stakeholders, not just staff, because we want to understand what are some of those top-down priorities. Now, in terms of these approaches, I'm going to lump them into, I guess, retro techniques. Look, they still have a role, but wherever possible, use these good modern techniques for doing research because they're going to give you a deeper information with a greater degree of context around it. Now, then, in terms of the role that intranets play within organizations, for a long time, we've had this model of 5 purposes of modern intranet. So intranet as a repository for content for staff, both corporate and business unit information. There's the intranet as a communications channel, ideally reaching all staff. There's the intranet that fosters the culture, strengthening it and celebrating staff within it, not bringing it down by being horrible, ugly, and dated. So something that has positive impact on culture. There's the intranet supporting collaboration and social. Now, this is something that now happens within the rest of the M365 environment. So this is not the role of the intranet itself to provide this functionality, but it does provide and should provide a really useful jumping off point into these tools, as well as giving some visibility about what's happening within them. And then ultimately, the intranet as a place for doing stuff. I mean, the Tas Water example is perfect around that, and I'll come back to that in a second. And then what you can do is you can use this as a way of planning. Where are we at the moment and where are we going to focus for the next year? Recognizing that there'll be different priorities across different organizations and that you can't push all the dials to the top in any given project. So then what does that look like in practice? So this is some of the research themes that came out of a recent project with a global nonprofit. And so we went off and we talked with people in Africa and Europe and South America. It was absolutely fascinating. I learned quite a lot about the importance of toilets and getting away from open defecation. You wasn't expecting me to drop that into the conversation, I imagine. But anyway, the things one learns. Now, we learned that the current intranet sucked and that, in fact, no one used it. And in fact, many people didn't even recognize it when they saw it. So, okay, so that's not surprising. We identified more broader things so that there is an issue around internal communications that could be improved, and that there's a centralized culture within the organization that they needed to move away from. But then relevant to the whole 365 environment and looking at, for example, at Elizabeth's talk this morning, there's a real issue around digital literacy, that they'd rolled out SharePoint, but a lot of people didn't know how to make best use of it, and that knowledge management was a key driver that hadn't yet been established organisationally. So then from that, we worked with them to come up with a vision. And this one's a pretty broad one for them because they had some substantial ambitions. So culture first and foremost, followed by internal comms and trusted communication. And then all of this to advance their mission to deliver programmatic excellence. So this is the why. This is what we're trying to achieve, and this is the ultimate outcome that we want. And then digging down into this, because it's very easy for this to become a bunch of sort of generic statements. We see a lot of sort of intranet vision and goal statements that could be copied and pasted between organizations. And while there are some fundamentals, it is tremendously important to put it in the context of the organization itself and its drivers in this kind of way. This was another example, much shorter, much punchier, I think really interesting. So this was for one of the area health services in New South Wales, so public health. And so coming out of a really collaborative process of narrowing down the highest objectives down to the vision and ultimately down to goals and scope, the vision that came out was to deliver a clinician first, mobile first digital workplace, to deliver better, more efficient healthcare. And it was fascinating because there was actually a discussion in one workshop between key stakeholders where the CIO said, look, wait a second, this clinician first thing, why would we be focusing only on 1/3 of our organization? And then the head of HR piped up and said, look, actually, last year we redefined the definition of clinician because it's actually about not just the doctors and nurses, it's about all of those frontline staff that support the delivery of services. So actually, clinicians as a workforce is now 2/3 of our staff, not 1/3. And then actually they're the hardest group to deliver to. So if we meet their needs, then we'll meet everyone's needs. And, we're just standing back, right? This is a conversation they're having themselves, which is tremendously powerful because then this becomes their vision to deliver what they, a great outcome. So then what does this mean in SharePoint Online? So first off, the importance of delivering to a key set of business outcomes and having a clear vision, is every bit as powerful now in SharePoint Online as it has been for the last 25 years. And so we really do want to get this right before going into the environment. There is clearly the role to play, for the intranet to play a role as the enterprise front door into the broader digital workplace. So that jumping off point into now a rich set of tools, noting that it's probably going to be an enterprise front door, not the enterprise front door. So with things like Teams and Viva Connections and the other Viva tools, which I'll talk more about in a second, there's going to be an entry point from Teams and from mobile devices and other entry points. And that's fine, but we still want a great enterprise front door through that traditional intranet. But ultimately, this is where we want to say, okay, for moving into this environment that is so much more than just SharePoint Online, let's make the most of it rather than delivering, the same old that we've done in the past. And so this is where we use things like Power Platform. So this is from Singapore Power, with the people going out and checking on gas leaks throughout Singapore. These are the outstanding tasks. This is the simple form that they've used to collect the data. This then allows them actually to look at things geographically. So instead, in the past, they would have sent people out, job by job, regardless of where that's located, but by using built-in tools, they're able to group the jobs together and save time. And then exactly like Blake was talking about from TasWater, this is where we deliver real time savings, not just time saved finding stuff, which is kind of a bullshit sort of metric, frankly. This is real time saved doing real tasks, right? And there's enormous power in this. And this is where this broader focus on the digital workplace and the digital employee experience really plays dividends. This is MassMutual's intranet. And so this is where they're starting to do integration in a really simple form. So this is on the homepage, is integration with ServiceNow and with Workday to surface some key details. But this is really where I want to talk about some of this future-looking stuff that Microsoft is doing. So Viva in particular. So there are a lot of great tools coming out right now. So the ones we know, insights, topics, learning, connections, some of which we've used, many of which we haven't yet, but that's to come. There are the new tools, and look, the challenge I'll put out there in your own time, I'll give you 5 seconds, is to think about, can you actually identify what these icons mean at the bottom? There's the answer, by the way. Oh, and there's this new thing, Viva Amplify. It's been launched. I cannot find an icon for that anywhere. I've seen it briefly in a video. So look, it just goes to show how fast this stuff is moving. And I'm going to pick one bit out of this. I'm going to pick the Viva Connections dashboard, which is really clunkily named, but is a really powerful feature. Because we've been talking about an enterprise task list for well over a decade, but it's been required heavyweight development. But now there's a framework that does at least half your work for you, which enables you to integrate with systems and surface them up into the intranet, with a good structure for how we present this, and how we pull this together. And this card-based view is really great. Now, this is new. Now, for our clients, we are often recommending that, when we're helping them to go out to market for a SharePoint partner to do the delivery, that this is something they pilot. Because, we're still working out, and I think Microsoft is still working out exactly how all this stuff works. But this is where I think we do want to be on the front foot around this, to say, okay, let's really grab those useful, powerful features. Not just use the out of the box stuff, like the default cards for Viva Connections dashboard are toys. But I think we need to do more integration, and then we deliver value. So I think there's some lovely stuff around this. And ultimately, just keeping an eye on time, noting I'm going to run just a couple of minutes over. So in terms of managed and governed, then look, the best practice, and I think Beth really covered this beautifully, intranets must be sustainable over time. And this does involve us shifting towards more of a product management philosophy rather than a one-off, project for delivering the upgrade or the migration. And ultimately, this governance, it needs to be holistic, not just around policy documents, governance, rules and requirements, but about how things are done in practice. So a little while back, we came up with a holistic model called the intranet operating model. It's hexagonal, I guess, maybe because I'm a beekeeper. And at the heart of things, there's the direction. Where are we going to? And I think Beth's talk was lovely around this, to say, how do you get stakeholders together is about creating that common vision and all of the engagement that takes. So, what is the end point that we're trying to get to in terms of the intranet? And then what are those traditional elements in terms of standards, and accountability and the like on the guiding side? But then what are the things on the doing side? How are we supporting stuff? How are we managing the side? How are we delivering new solutions? And in the work that we do, we've got good templates to cover all of these fundamentals. What's the role of the intranet sponsor? What's the role of the intranet steering committee, or whatever it's called? What is the accountability structure that you can see on the left? But then in SharePoint Online, what does this mean? Well, look, the governance fundamentals still stay the same, and look, are even more important, because unless you govern this stuff, you will have thousands of sites that you have zero visibility of and zero management of. So there is a need for strong governance within this dispersed landscape, recognizing that we are going to push governance down, so that maybe we're governing sites rather than trying to govern every individual page. And therefore, the provisioning and management of sites becomes much, much more important. And will often and really should be then positioning SharePoint Online governance within the context of the broader digital workplace. So that in practice, so we've talked for a while about a graduated governance, that instead of managing all content as if it is of the same importance, that we sort of govern things as tiers, and as you go down in the structure where it's narrower focus or a smaller audience, we have lower standards. Then this actually works really well within this flat environment of different sites, because then we can kind of flag it at a site by site level. And this is for a complex organization that had both group-wide sites and local divisional sites. And it's also about some of the things we've seen in this year's awards. So this is Man Energy Solutions and the work they put into site provisioning. And there's a lot of good tools that help guide people. You know, this is what we're offering you in this area. This is how it works. Is this what you want? A checkbox, which I think is quite nice. And then, you know, this is the site details. We collect the site metadata, you know, the terms and conditions, the governance of this. And there is increasingly good support for this in the platform. There's a lot of good third-party solutions. And so I think there's a lot of work that we can do around this. But look, ultimately, coming back to the 4 fundamentals of successful intranets: usable, findable, valuable, and governed. So these still stand strong, and these are still the guiding lights that we should all be following. So I do think, though, we should be looking at what we are getting coming down the pipeline. 365 has the fastest pace of innovation of any enterprise platform in the history of computing. That is my genuine view. Now, that's kind of overwhelming. This change is happening all the time, and keeping on top of them is hard. But we want to be drawing down these tools and making use of them. But let's not obsess about it. Right? This is a tool. This is not the outcome. This is not the intranet. This is not employee needs. So we don't have to spend all of our time parsing every update and every possible thing coming down the pipeline. Because at the end of the day, we want to keep our focus on delivering an essential intranet that's of real value to both employees and the organization as a whole. And taking a breath, I will say thank you.